Arizona Territory, 1879. The stagecoach burst into flames halfway between Prescott and the Salt River, and Virginia Nolan barely escaped with her life. She hit the rocky trail hard, her bonnet torn, her canvas skirt ripped at the hem, smoke choking her lungs as she scrambled through the dust. The driver had been shot clean through the neck before the coach even went off the road. Whatever outlaws had fired those first shots were gone now, leaving the wreck to burn in the middle of the sun-baked trail. Virginia coughed, stumbling away from the blaze, her hands scraped, her chest heaving. Her trunk was still inside, along with the letters her father wrote her before he died, but the fire was too hot to get near it. The heat pressed against her back like a hand, and she kept walking until her legs gave out and she dropped to her knees. She was alone. The only other passenger, a man from Yuma, had taken a bullet to the chest back near Wagon Bend. She had not screamed when the coach tipped or when she climbed out from the broken side. But now, with no sound but the crackling fire and the desert wind, she cried. A lone rider crested the ridge above her, silhouetted in the falling sun. He rode hard, fast, dust trailing behind his horse like a comet. She did not move. She had no strength left to run or shout. She just watched through the blur of tears and smoke as the man pulled up beside her, swung off his saddle and dropped to one knee. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, urgent, and his hands hovered near her shoulders without touching. "Miss, can you hear me?" Virginia nodded, though her mouth was too dry to answer. The cowboy's eyes were golden brown, steady and sharp. His jaw was square, his tan skin streaked with trail sweat and dust. His hat was worn at the brim, his shirt sun-bleached and open at the throat. He carried a rifle strapped across his back and a scar along the right side of his neck that looked like an old knife wound. "I saw the smoke," he said, glancing back at the flames. "You the only one made it out," she nodded again, slower this time, and whispered, "Yes, all right." "You're safe now?" He lifted her gently to her feet, one arm around her back, the other steadying her hand as she leaned into him. The heat of his body grounded her, and she let herself lean. "I'm Zachary Fletcher," he said. "My cabin's not far." "Can you ride?" "I think so," she said, her voice rough and unused. He helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her, his arms anchoring her in place. She rested against him without protest, her cheek brushing the front of his shirt, the scent of leather and pine and something warm filling her lungs. They rode in silence. The sun dipped low, and shadows stretched long over the desert. It was full dark by the time they reached his place, a one-room cabin tucked beside a dry creek bed, surrounded by cottonwoods. Zachary helped her down and opened the door with one hand, then lit a lantern with the other. Inside, it was simple rifle rack, table, 2 chairs, iron stove, a cot in the corner covered with a wool blanket. He brought her water first, then bread, then a clean cloth and a tin basin for her hands. She did not ask questions, neither did he. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. "Thank you, you saved me." Zachary gave a quiet nod. "You saved yourself, I just showed up afterward." She watched him as he sat beside the hearth. His hands were rough, the kind that knew work, but they had been gentle with her. His eyes held no judgment, only concern. She could not remember the last time someone looked at her like that. "It was a gang," she said after a long moment. "They rode out of nowhere, shot the driver, I do not know why. There was not even much money on board." "Some do it for the thrill of it," he said, "or maybe they thought there was more. Either way, they will not come near here, not without me knowing." She believed him. He made her tea from dried mint leaves and let her sit in his chair while he took the stool. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared at the fire. "I was on my way to Phoenix," she said, "to start over. My father died last spring. I sold the house in Missouri. Thought I might find work teaching." Zachary nodded slowly. "That why you were out here alone?" "Yes." He did not press further. She was grateful for that. When she fell asleep that night, it was not from exhaustion, but from the strange comfort of his presence. She lay on the cot, wrapped in his blanket, while he took the floor without complaint. She listened to the sound of his breathing in the dark, steady and calm, and knew she was safe. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and cornbread. Zachary was outside chopping wood, his shirt sleeves rolled up, strong arms swinging the axe with practiced rhythm. She watched him through the open door for a long time before stepping outside. "Good morning," she said. He turned, wiped the sweat from his brow, and smiled. "Morning." "You sleep all right." "I did." He made breakfast and they ate under the cottonwoods. She told him her name, Virginia Nolan, and he repeated it like he wanted to remember how it felt in his mouth. They spent that day gathering supplies from his small garden, checking his traps, hauling water. He showed her how to use his old rifle just in case. She listened closely. By the third day, she was helping him repair the fence around his goats. She had stopped shaking when she thought of the fire. She had started smiling at him when his hand brushed hers. Later, as they sat by the fire again, he looked at her with something different in his eyes, something warm and wide and quiet. "You could stay," he said simply, "if you wanted." Virginia looked at the fire, then back at him. "I might." Zachary reached across the space between them and took her hand. "You are strong, Virginia, stronger than most. I know what it is like to be alone out here, but you are not alone now." Her fingers tightened around his. "Neither are you." And just like that, something new took root between them, not rushed, not spoken in grand words, just real and steady. She had escaped a burning coach on the dusty trail. A cowboy had rushed in, and together they were rising. The wind shifted that morning, carrying the scent of creosote and something faintly coppery from the east storm smell, though the sky stayed clear. Virginia stood by the goat pen, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scraping mud from the trough with a flat-bladed spade. Her skirts were pinned up for work, her hands raw beneath the nails. She hadn't once thought about Phoenix since waking. Zachary returned from the hills before noon, his saddle bags heavy with dried mesquite pods and a small sack of flour tied behind the cantle. When he stepped down from the horse, he caught her eye and tilted his chin toward the porch. "There's something I'd like to show you." Virginia wiped her palms on her apron and followed him without a word. They walked beyond the cottonwoods, past the edge of the gulch where the land flattened and the soil took on a darker hue. He stopped beside a low rise where the grass grew taller, undisturbed. A rough wooden cross stood there, weathered and half sunk, no name carved on it. "My brother," Zachary said. "Name was Ali. He built that cabin with me back when we thought we were making a cattle outfit." Her gaze lingered on the cross, then turned to him. "What happened?" Snakebite. "Took him before I could ride for help." "That was 5 years ago this spring." She didn't speak, just reached for his hand. He let her take it, his fingers curling slow around hers. "I didn't bring you here for sympathy," he said after a moment, voice low. "Just figured if you're staying might be right for you to know." Virginia looked out over the grass. "I'm not afraid of ghosts, only men who make them." He gave a quiet breath of a laugh, no smile on his face, but something eased in his shoulders. They returned to the cabin by way of the dry creek, where she knelt and sifted through sun-bleached stones until she found one smooth and pale as milk. She left it beside the cross without a word, and Zachary said nothing, but when they walked back, he put his hand lightly on the small of her back, just for a second. That evening, the wind picked up sharp. Zachary nailed an extra hide across the lower part of the door and brought in more wood. Virginia stirred a pot of beans on the stove, adding wild sage he'd gathered days before. While they ate, she asked, "What made you stay?" He leaned back, gaze on the fire. "Didn't want to leave him behind, and I guess I didn't know where else to go." She nodded, then set her spoon down. "I came west thinking I'd write children's primers. I had a little book of poems in my trunk. Gone now, of course." Zachary looked over at her, something different in his expression. "Were they yours?" She shrugged. "Some, most were things I copied from others. But I'd planned to teach them by heart. Children remember better when the words feel like music." He stood up and fetched a small tin box from the shelf above the hearth. Inside were folded pages, maps mostly, and a few yellowed letters. He laid one in her lap. "Illy's writing." He used to try his hand at verse 2. That one's about the river north of here. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and gave it back. "He had a good ear. I think he'd have liked you." She met his eyes. "I think I'd have liked him." The silence stretched between them, warm this time. He didn't move to put the letter away. Instead, he sat across from her again, elbows resting on his knees. "Virginia," he said, quiet, "you don't owe me anything for helping you. I want you to stay, but only if it's yours to choose." "I know," she said. He waited. "I've never had much say in where I end up," she said. "Most of my life was decided by men who didn't ask what I wanted, but here with you. It's the first time I felt like I could choose to stay, and it'd mean something." Zachary reached across the small space and touched her wrist, just enough to ground her. "You're not someone who drifts," he said. "You're someone who plants." She turned her hand over and let her fingers rest against his. The air between them was full of unspoken things, but none of them needed naming. Later, when the wind died and the fire burned low, he offered her the cot again, but she shook her head. "I'd rather sit a while longer." He nodded, and they stayed there, side by side on the floor, backs against the logs, watching the last embers fade. No words, just the steady rhythm of two people breathing the same air, listening to the same quiet. In the morning, she'd go with him to check the fence line along the west ridge. After that, maybe she'd start sewing curtains for the window. He had extra muslin in the trunk by the door, and she'd already seen the needle and thread. Neither of them said it, but they both felt it, a slow, certain shift. Something beginning, not just for the day, but for all the days after. The sun climbed slow over the mesa, casting long shadows across the ridgeline. Virginia stood near the edge of the pasture, one hand shading her brow, watching Zachary mend a break in the wire. The early light caught the curve of his neck, the set of his shoulders as he worked. He hadn't spoken much since they left the cabin that morning, but it wasn't a silence that pushed her out. It was one that let her in. "Is that from Coyotes?" she asked, nodding toward the torn post. He straightened, wiping his palms on his trousers. "Could be, or elk. They come down from the hills when the grass dries out up there." She stepped closer, studying the wire. "How often do they get through?" "Not often enough to keep me up, but enough to keep me working." He held out the pliers. She took them without hesitation, gripping the wire as he showed her where to twist. The sun warmed her back and sweat beaded at her temples, but she didn't stop until the last strand was taut. Zachary leaned against the post, arms crossed. "You catch on quick." "I've had to," she said. He watched her a moment longer, then turned toward the slope. "There's a spring farther up. We can fill the canteens before heading back." The trail wound narrow through the scrub, the soil turning redder as they climbed. Birds flicked between the junipers, and a hawk circled high above. They reached the spring by mid-morning, tucked beneath a rock shelf, the water cool and clear. Virginia crouched, dipping one hand in. "Never thought I'd miss cold water," she said. Zachary filled both canteens, then sat beside her on the stone ledge. "You said you came from Missouri." "That where you grew up?" She nodded. "Near the Gasconade. My father had a press small but enough to keep him working. He taught me to set type before I could read it." He glanced at her. "That's not something most girls were learning. He said it'd give me something no one could take, a skill. A way to stand on my own." Zachary turned the canteen in his hands, the light catching the metal rim. "Sounds like he was a good man." "He was," she said softly. "Didn't always know how to say things, but he showed them." Something shifted in Zachary's face, then not sorrow exactly, but that quiet understanding that only comes from losses carried too long. Virginia's voice dropped. "You said you and Ellie were going to start a cattle outfit. What stopped you besides?" She hesitated, then finished. "Besides what happened?" He drew in a breath, slow. "We didn't have enough head, not really. The land's rough out here, water's thin. We kept telling ourselves we'd build it up, but truth is we were scraping by." He paused. "After I buried him, I couldn't look at the herd without thinking about all the plans we made. Sold them off to a man out of Camp Verde, figured I'd turn to goats, keep things small." She looked out across the valley. "He'd have forgiven you, I know." His voice was low. "I just never told him I was tired of chasing a dream that was killing us both." Virginia didn't answer right away. She reached over and laid her hand on his forearm, steady and sure. "You're not the only one who's had to walk away from something you once believed in." He met her gaze. There was no pity in it, only clarity and something deeper, something that had been growing between them since the day he'd pulled her from the trail. They stayed there until the sun shifted overhead. On the way down, she asked about the path that twisted west toward the distant ridge. He told her it led to an old mine, long dry, but good for shelter if a storm ever caught someone out. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had turned the color of pale wheat. Zachary set the canteens by the door, then turned to her. "There's a man who comes down from Prescott every third week," he said. "Trades salt, tobacco, sometimes books. He'll be by tomorrow." She untied the scarf from her hair, brushing dust from her brow. "Does he take coin or just goods?" "Both." "Why, there's something I'd like to ask him for if he has it." He waited. "Paper, ink doesn't need to be much. I've held too many words in my head too long." He gave a slow nod. "All right. I'll put it on the list." That night she sat with him beneath the stars, her knees folded beneath her skirt, the air cool against her skin. He handed her a piece of dried apple, and she took it with a soft laugh. "You feed me like you're fattening a hen. You eat like someone who's never had the time to sit still." They watched the moon rise over the pines, silver light spilling across the roof. She tilted her head back, eyes closed for a breath. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Used to," he said. "Not lately." He turned to her. "You," she opened her eyes. "I think I stopped running the moment I stepped off your horse." He didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. The truth hung between them, quiet and certain as the night air. Whatever had broken in the desert, whatever had burned, it wasn't what defined them. What mattered now was what came next, and they would build it together. The trader arrived 2 days late, his mule limping and his boots crusted with red clay. Zachary met him near the bluff, bartering quietly while Virginia waited by the porch, a shallow basket of prickly pear fruit tucked in her arm. When Zachary returned, he handed her a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, 2 sheets of coarse paper, a stub of graphite, and a glass inkwell with a cork stopper that rattled when she shook it gently. "I'll keep the paper for now," she said. "But you can use the pencil first if you like." He shook his head. "I've got nothing worth writing down." "You will," she said, and tucked the bundle into the shelf beside the hearth. The days shortened with the turning of the season. Wind pressed harder through the trees, and the hills went quiet as the birds thinned out. Virginia began mending the seams of an old flannel shirt she found in Zachary's chest, stitching in long, even rows by the light of the fire. She didn't ask whose it had been. He didn't offer. One morning, Zachary returned from the ridge with a bruise blooming beneath his eye and a tear at the corner of his shirt. "Mountain lion," he said, setting down his rifle. "Didn't get close enough to bite, but close enough to mean it." Virginia examined the claw marks across the leather of his shoulder strap. "You're lucky." "Luck's just another word for not being dead, far as I can tell." She reached for a strip of clean cotton and dipped it in hot water. "Sit." As she pressed the cloth to his temple, he didn't flinch. His eyes stayed steady on hers. "Only thing I thought about when it lunged," he said, "was whether you'd still be here if I didn't come back." She dabbed the blood carefully. "I would have stayed long enough to bury you." He let out a soft breath, not quite amusement, not quite relief. "I'm not afraid of what's out there," she added. "Not anymore." He studied her then. "What are you afraid of?" She hesitated, cloth still resting in her palm. "Forgetting what it's like to want a thing and believe I might keep it." Zachary didn't answer right away. He reached up and took the cloth from her hand, setting it aside. "You ever wondered what it'd be like," he said, "if we stopped waiting for the other to leave?" "I haven't wondered," she said. "I've decided." He touched her wrist, light and sure. "You mean to stay?" "I mean to live," she said. "And that happens here." That night, they moved the cot to the far wall and laid another blanket beside it, the fire casting long shadows across the floor. They didn't speak much, but when their hands found each other beneath the quilts, it was with an ease that felt like arriving home after a hard ride. The next day, Virginia walked past the fence line toward the ridge and found a patch of ground where the soil was soft. She knelt there, hands in the dirt, turning it over with slow patience. When Zachary found her there, she looked up and smiled. "Thought I'd try growing something come spring. Beans, maybe, or squash." He crouched beside her. "Ground's good there. Gets morning light. I figured it might. I could build you a box for the seedlings, keep them off the frost," she nodded, "and I'll teach you how to prune them without killing the whole thing." He reached for her hand, brushing the soil from her fingers. "We'll make a fine team." She leaned into his side, the air smelling of earth and pine and a future not yet spoken aloud. They stayed like that until the sun began to slip behind the hills, shadows stretching long across the land they'd come to share. Neither of them said the word for what they were building, but it was there in the way they rose with the same rhythm each morning, in the quiet meals, in the long walks along the creek. That evening, as the fire crackled low and the wind settled, Virginia took out the paper and laid it on the table. The graphite pencil fit snug in her fingers, worn but sharp enough. She wrote a single line at the top of the page. Then she looked across the room where Zachary sat sharpening his blade, the lamplight catching the edge of his jaw. "I want to write about this place," she said. He didn't look up. "Then you should. Not just the land, us, what it feels like to build something after the burning. After the running." Now he turned slowly. "Then start with that, the rising." She smiled and bent over the page. Outside, the wind shifted again. This time it carried only the scent of cedar smoke and something green beginning just beneath the roots. The first frost came soft, dusting the edge of the creek bed, turning the breath of morning into steam. Virginia stood barefoot at the doorstep, shawl drawn around her shoulders, watching the goats stir in their pen. Inside, Zachary was splitting kindling down to slivers, careful not to wake her too soon. She had risen early anyway, her body used to the rhythm of the land now, her days woven into the shape of this place like thread in wool. She turned when he stepped outside, his sleeves rolled, jaw rough with 2 days of beard. He held a tin cup in one hand, steam curling from it. "Woke to find frost on the saddle horn," he said. "Guess it's time to pull the winter coats down. I'll stitch the lining in yours today," she said, taking the cup from him. "You'll need it before week's end." He reached behind her and ran a thumb gently along her braid, then let it fall. "You always know what's needed before I do. That's just paying attention." "No," he said, voice low. "That's care." She didn't answer, only held the cup close, letting the warmth settle through her fingers. By mid-morning, she was in the garden bed, pulling the last of the onions from the softening dirt. Zachary worked on the lean-to roof, replacing a warped beam with one he'd rough cut from the pine that fell last month. Neither of them spoke much through the morning. The quiet between them had grown into something comfortable, like the hush of snow before a storm present, but never empty. At midday, a rider appeared on the far trail, waving to signal peace long before he came close. Zachary stepped off the roof and met him at the fence. The man, lean and sun-beaten, carried a letter wrapped in oilskin and tied with a ribbon gone pale from sun. He tipped his hat to Virginia as she approached. "Come up from Florence," he said. "Postmaster, they're said to bring this to a Nolan if I pass through these parts." Virginia wiped her hands on her apron and took the letter carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name signed at the bottom, Elsie Hargrove, was not. She hadn't seen it since her father's funeral when his cousin came from Hannibal and offered to buy the press outright. She opened the letter slowly, her eyes scanning the page. When she finished, she folded it once more and looked out toward the hills. "She's selling the press," she said. "Says she's too old to run it now. Offered me first rights since it was my father's." Zachary leaned against the fence rail, watching her face. "You thinking about it?" "I thought I might feel something more," she said. "But it's like someone else's memory now." "You don't owe anyone your past," he said. "Only your future." She looked at him a long time. "Then I choose this." The rider tipped his hat again and turned back toward the ridge. They watched him disappear into the trees before heading inside. That evening, Virginia finished the final seam on Zachary's coat and hung it by the door. He added another log to the stove and pulled the curtains closed. She stood at the table, her hands resting on the paper she'd begun weeks before. Words had filled the page, now a kind of record, not just of the land, but of the days they'd made together. A life written not through grand events, but through the steady rhythm of care. She laid the pencil down, turned, and walked to where he stood. "I want to marry you," she said plainly. Zachary's eyes met hers, steady as ever. You've already given me more than I thought I'd ever have, but if you're asking, then yes, I want that. I want a life with your name beside mine. We'll do it quiet, she said. Just us and the land to witness. He reached for her hand, kissed the back of it, and said, We'll do it true. They were married 4 days later beneath the cottonwoods just past the creek, where the earth still held warmth from the late sun. She wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin dyed with walnut hulls, and he shaved close for the first time in weeks. They spoke their promises under open sky, no preacher, no crowd, just the wind and the branches and the soft murmur of water. That night, they built a fire in the yard and cooked cornbread in the Dutch oven. She leaned against him, watching the stars rise one by one. I used to think starting over meant becoming someone else, she said. But maybe it just means becoming more yourself in the right place. Zachary wrapped his arm around her waist. Then we're right where we're meant to be. Years passed, and the land changed with them. Spring brought a daughter with Zachary's calm and Virginia's fire. They named her Clara, after Zachary's mother, whose name he hadn't spoken until the night Virginia gave birth. Virginia taught her letters by the stove, coaxing her fingers along the page. Zachary built her a cradle from the same pine he'd used to fix the lean-to. They planted beans and squash in the garden, and Clara grew up with dirt beneath her nails and poems on her tongue. When traders passed through, they stayed longer, drawn by the warmth that lived in the cabin now. Zachary added a second room, then a third, and Virginia filled the shelves with papers, letters, and stories of the land. The garden bloomed every spring. The fence held through each winter. And each night, after the child was asleep and the fire burned low, Zachary and Virginia sat together in the quiet, their hands never far from one another. They had built a life not from what they had lost, but from what they chose each day, each season, each breath. And they never stopped choosing.